High above the bustling terminals of John F. Kennedy International Airport, a single flight is about to redefine what it means to stand up for what's right. Can you imagine a tense showdown at 30,000 feet, where one passenger's arrogance picks the wrong target? Stay tuned to Dark Stories to find out. In this gripping tale, an unthinkably arrogant passenger targets the wrong person for his bigotry, unaware that his supposed victim has formidable allies hidden in plain sight. What begins as a routine trip soon spirals into a shocking battle of words, wits, and revelations that shake an entire cabin. Buckle up, because this is no ordinary flight on Dark Stories. This is the story of one woman's resilience, one man's misguided hatred, and the unstoppable force of justice waiting to be unleashed. Danielle Cooper glanced at her boarding pass, excitement fluttering in her chest, despite her attempt to stay composed. It was a breezy early morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. The sounds of overhead announcements, rolling luggage, and murmuring crowds converged around Gate 47, where her flight to Los Angeles would soon depart. Her travel had become more frequent in recent months. Work obligations, a personal research project, and a much-needed break from the daily grind were all reasons that pulled her to the West Coast. She was expecting a straightforward, if long, flight filled with the usual pleasantries and mild inconveniences of commercial air travel. Danielle's eyes flickered across the concourse to a cafe, where she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She was dressed in a simple, comfortable outfit, soft black slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a light jacket. If anyone had bothered to observe her more closely, they might have noticed her poised posture and that she seemed far more focused than the average traveler. But her calm demeanor blended in with the throngs of people waiting by the gate, just another face in the sea of travelers. Yet, this was no ordinary flight, at least not for the people who truly knew who Danielle Cooper was. For months, she'd lived under a spotlight that most never realize exists. Want to know why? Keep watching Dark Stories for the shocking truth. Shocking events had placed her name on certain watch lists, some benevolent, some hostile. Quietly, she had the protection of 2 U.S. Marshals traveling incognito, watching every subtle move around her. Danielle wasn't just a busy professional, she was also a federal judge, recently assigned to high-profile cases targeting dangerous groups. Threats against her had soared, necessitating extreme measures. Although she did not wear the black robe in the airport, nor did she openly show any emblem of her profession, she was never truly alone. Outside the gate area, the marshals were discreetly positioned. Both men looked unassuming. One wore a worn leather jacket and casual jeans, the other sported a baseball cap pulled low, his expression unreadable. They observed Danielle from a short distance, exchanging the briefest of nods when her eyes swept in their direction. Their vigilance was polished, refined. They'd been tailing Danielle on every flight for the past 2 months, ever since a particularly violent threat had landed on a federal wire. But Danielle herself moved through the crowd with an air of gentle confidence. She was not the type to live in fear. In the spirit of normalcy, she tried to go about her day. After a brief moment deciding whether she needed a coffee, she eventually chose a bottle of water and took a seat at the gate. She perused the bright screen on her phone, casually checking updates on her cases, then switching to social media to take her mind off work. Unbeknownst to her, a storm of hatred was already brewing in a corner of that boarding area. Someone who noticed her disliked what they saw and was already stirring trouble behind the scenes. Boarding began as Danielle waited in her designated zone. She felt a presence behind her, someone's eyes drilling into the back of her head. Turning slightly, she caught sight of a man in a rumpled navy suit, scowling at her. He was tall, heavy-set, with graying hair around the temples and a stiff posture that gave him an air of self-importance. His face was contorted into an expression of obvious displeasure. Danielle wondered if she was blocking his path, so she instinctively stepped to the side, but he didn't move. He just kept staring. Danielle offered a polite smile. "Go ahead," she encouraged, gesturing to let him pass in the line. The man's lip curled slightly, as though repulsed by her mere courtesy. But there was little time to process his reaction because the line began to advance. People moved forward, scanning their boarding passes. The flight crew smiled as they gestured passengers aboard. Danielle stole a quick glance at the 2 marshals. One had merged seamlessly into the line behind her, the other still lingered a few passengers back. They communicated only with the most subtle body language, just enough to let her know she was safe. As she entered the aircraft, Danielle smiled at the flight attendant who greeted her with a warm, "Welcome aboard, Miss Cooper." Danielle appreciated that small moment of recognition. She found her seat, 21B, an aisle seat in the main cabin. She carefully stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, retrieving a small novel and her phone before settling in. And there he was again, the tall man with the pinched expression that seemed permanently etched onto his face. She saw him scanning the row numbers with an impatient glance. His ticket read 21C, the seat right across the aisle from her. She prepared to put on a neutral expression, determined not to let any sense of foreboding spoil her trip. After all, she'd encountered unfriendly people in her line of work many times. Perhaps he was just stressed, or maybe the flight had already rattled him. "Excuse me," Danielle said politely, letting him pass down the narrow aisle. He grunted in response, lifting his suitcase with more force than necessary, slamming it into the overhead bin. Each movement was loud, aggressive, drawing uneasy looks from a few other passengers who had already taken their seats. Danielle watched with mild apprehension. Something about his scowl told her that her presence was unwelcome in his eyes. She couldn't quite identify why, but a creeping sense of tension began to build in her stomach. Little did she realize that tension was about to explode in ways no one could have predicted. The aircraft began to fill, other passengers hurried in to avoid slowing the line. Overhead bins began to fill up, and seats were quickly occupied. Danielle put on her seatbelt, flipping through the in-flight magazine as she waited for takeoff to commence. The tall man across the aisle did the same, though in a much more restless manner, rustling pages and sighing dramatically at intervals, as though each minor inconvenience was a personal affront. As the plane reached capacity, a flight attendant made the standard announcements about safety procedures and carry-on stowage. Through it all, Danielle remained outwardly composed, though every so often, she caught the man shooting her withering glares. She tried to ignore him, focusing instead on her reading material and the tasks she'd set for herself, finalize notes for an upcoming hearing, check a few scheduling details, and possibly find time to watch a movie on the in-flight system. Then came the moment that first escalated things. The flight attendant began walking down the aisle, verifying seatbelts and overhead compartments, when she paused at the man's row to request that he stow his laptop bag under the seat. He let out an audible grunt. "Is there a problem, sir?" the attendant asked courteously. He glanced at Danielle, then at the attendant, the beginnings of a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. "I can't believe you're giving me instructions when the flight is letting just anyone on board." His eyes flicked sideways at Danielle, as if she were an unwanted stowaway. The flight attendant's brow furrowed, but she tried to maintain a professional demeanor. "I'm sorry, sir, but these are standard FAA regulations." He rolled his eyes but complied, shoving his bag aggressively under the seat. Danielle's heart sank. She recognized the subtle implication in his words. Letting just anyone on board was an all-too-familiar phrase, coated in prejudice. She had dealt with such veiled remarks before, but the hostility in his tone made her uneasy. Glancing diagonally behind her, she caught sight of one of the marshals. He was 2 rows back, discreetly observing. His mouth was set in a neutral line, but he gave her a quiet, reassuring nod when their eyes met. If anything were to escalate, he was there, and so was his partner. The flight began its pushback from the gate, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane taxied onto the runway. With a slight hum from the engines building, the plane readied itself for takeoff. Danielle took a deep breath, intentionally visualizing the steady climb into the sky and the promise of landing safely on the other side of the country, away from the tension next to her. But as soon as the plane lifted off, the man's annoyance magnified. He shifted in his seat, muttering to himself in a voice just loud enough for those around him to hear, offering passive-aggressive commentary about how they let people run wild or what's become of public transportation these days. The more he muttered, the clearer his disdain for Danielle appeared. His body language was hostile, arms folded, jaw clenched, eyes filled with something that churned dangerously close to hate. Danielle tried to distract herself by looking out the window across her row, focusing on the breathtaking view of the city below as the plane rose into the morning sky. She forced a smile, reminding herself that soon this leg of the journey would be over, and she could continue her work in Los Angeles. But the man's energy was too potent to ignore for long. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. welcoming passengers aboard American Airlines Flight 481 from New York to Los Angeles, outlining the flight duration of around 6 hours, weather forecasts, and approximate arrival times. Danielle listened intently, hoping to glean anything that might help her keep her mind busy instead of dwelling on her neighbor's blatant hostility. Deep inside, a pang of worry flickered. What if, by some strange coincidence, this man recognized her? She was, after all, a federal judge presiding over some explosive cases. Maybe he had read news articles. Maybe he had an axe to grind with the justice system. The possibility lingered, unsettling her, but she couldn't jump to conclusions. She had no evidence that he knew who she was. Yet his scowls continued to sharpen every time he laid eyes on her. Something told Danielle that her mere presence offended him, and it likely had nothing to do with any legal matter. It was the color of her skin that sparked his anger. She had seen that expression before, in courtrooms where certain defendants seethed at the idea of being judged by a black woman. She had felt it in public spaces where biases were laid bare, and that knowledge added a silent tension to the flight that shouldn't exist in 2025. It happened about 30 minutes into the flight, while the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. A flight attendant was offering beverages. Danielle politely asked for water with ice. The attendant handed it to her with a bright, professional smile. She began to take a sip, only to hear the man across the aisle hiss in her direction. "You're the reason traveling has become unbearable," he muttered, just loud enough for Danielle to hear. She lowered her cup, turning her gaze to him. "Excuse me," she asked softly, hoping she'd misunderstood. He didn't look at her directly but continued in that same bitter tone. "I said, people like you ruin things for everyone else. Always special treatment, always a problem." She felt her pulse quicken. She inhaled deeply, forcing her voice to remain measured. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." He scoffed, finally glancing at her. There was no mistaking the venom in his eyes. "You wouldn't," he said. "I can't believe they just seat anyone next to respectable folks. You should be at the back, not up here." Danielle felt her cheeks burn. She had faced racism before, but never in such an unprovoked, brazen way on an airplane. It was humiliating, enraging, and terrifying all at once. Her mind whirled with possible reactions: call the flight attendant, engage calmly, or ignore him. Part of her training, both legal and personal, told her not to escalate. Another part, the part sick of injustice, told her to hold him accountable for his words. She chose the middle ground. In a calm voice, she said, "Sir, your words are out of line. I haven't done anything to you." That ignited him further. "You exist," he growled. "That's more than enough." Around them, a few passengers were starting to notice. Some stared in disbelief, while others pretended not to see. One flight attendant, working a different row, saw the tension but couldn't hear the words. Danielle glanced behind her for her marshals. They were watching intently but not intervening yet. They would step in if he became physically aggressive or threatened her more directly, but for the moment, this was a war of words. She took another sip of her water, her hands trembling slightly, and tried to ignore the pit in her stomach. The flight was still a long one, and it was clear that this man's hostility wasn't going to evaporate on its own. After the beverage service, the flight attendants came around offering snacks and the chance to purchase meals. Danielle tried to distract herself by ordering a small cheese plate. She kept her eyes on her phone, scrolling through updates. She read the news, scrolled social media, and momentarily wondered if it would be easier to shift seats. However, the flight was fully booked, and a seat change might call more attention to the situation than she wanted. The man across from her, who she would later learn was named Harvey Garrison, eventually picked up a magazine and pretended to read, but Danielle could sense the tension radiating off him. She never felt fully relaxed. Every movement of the flight crew and every passenger who walked down the aisle made her hyper-aware of her environment. She hadn't done a single thing to provoke him, yet his anger lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, ready to break. At one point, the plane experienced mild turbulence. The pilot advised passengers to remain seated and keep their seatbelts fastened. Danielle gripped her armrest, her stomach fluttering from both the plane's jostles and the anxious sense that the worst was yet to come. In her mind, she tried to run through her legal knowledge, reminding herself that confrontation with a passenger mid-flight could lead to serious consequences, both for the aggressor and for anyone who retaliated. Yet she had to wonder, if he grew more hostile, how safe would she be? Every so often, Danielle would discreetly check on the marshals. The one behind her, let's call him Marshal Brady, kept his gaze mostly forward, but his peripheral vision was razor-sharp. The other, Marshal Simmons, was seated several rows ahead, occasionally twisting to glance back. The air was thick with the sense of potential conflict. The seatbelt sign was turned off after the brief turbulence passed. People got up to use the restroom and stretch their legs. Danielle took this opportunity to stand, partly to clear her head and partly to remove herself from the toxic aura emanating from Harvey. She made her way toward the back of the plane, intending to use the restroom and maybe wash her face to ground herself. But as fate would have it, Harvey decided to get up at the same time. He followed behind her, or maybe they just happened to queue for the restroom simultaneously. The tension between them was palpable. Each step down the aisle felt loaded with significance. Passengers craned their necks, noticing the uneasy vibe, perhaps recognizing the possibility of confrontation. Danielle paused by the lavatories, waiting her turn. Harvey stood behind her, arms crossed. She could almost feel his breath on her neck. Then he leaned in, voice low and menacing. "I'm going to ask the crew to remove you when we land. There's no way people like you should be allowed on flights with normal Americans." Her chest tightened. She had tried to tell herself his hostility was the random anger of a stressed-out traveler, but now the bigotry in his words was an undeniable reality. She felt every muscle tense, her fight-or-flight response warring within her. She turned to face him, eyes locked onto his. "I have every right to be on this flight. You have no authority to remove me. Leave me alone." He smirked, leaning closer still, crossing the final boundary of personal space. "We'll see about that," he snarled. "A complaint from a respected passenger, a claim that you're acting suspicious, these things carry weight, especially these days." The unspoken insinuation was clear, he was more believable in his mind, and he intended to leverage society's biases to paint her as a threat. Marshal Brady had silently made his way down the aisle, standing a few rows back, appearing as though he was just waiting for the restroom. His gaze locked onto Harvey's stance and Danielle's tense figure, reading the moment like a professional, scanning for signs of imminent danger. For the moment, he held back, letting Danielle handle her own conversation, but every fiber in him was coiled, ready. The door to the restroom swung open, and the passenger who had been inside stepped out. Danielle quickly slipped in, shutting the door behind her. She locked it and stood there, exhaling a tremulous breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her heart pounded. She thought of her mother, who had always told her, "Keep your grace, but never let anyone trample your dignity." This situation tested both. She turned on the tap, splashed cool water on her face, and stared at herself in the tiny mirror. She was here to do her job, to live her life, and she had every right to it. When she re-emerged, Harvey had moved further back, presumably waiting for a second lavatory. She squeezed past him, ignoring the hateful energy in the air. Marshal Brady caught her eye with a hint of a question, silently asking if she was all right. She gave a small nod, her lips set in a thin line. For now, she was determined to weather this storm without creating a scene, if only Harvey would let it stay that way. Returning to her seat, Danielle felt a wave of relief just to be away from the small confines of the aisle. But her relief was short-lived. Harvey returned as well, plopping into his seat and glaring daggers across the aisle. The flight attendant who had earlier addressed his carry-on approached him again, this time with a subtle note of caution in her eyes. "Sir," she said quietly, "I want to ensure everything's all right. Several passengers have mentioned raised voices in the aisle." Harvey immediately scowled at Danielle, as if it were her fault that other people had ears. "The problem," he said loudly, "is that woman. She's harassing me. I have a right to ask that she be moved." Shock and outrage filled Danielle's chest, but she kept her composure, resisting the urge to lash out. The flight attendant glanced at Danielle, uncertain. "Ma'am, have you been causing a disturbance?" Quietly, Danielle replied, "No, I was only using the restroom." She didn't mention the hateful remarks Harvey had hurled at her, uncertain of whether confronting him verbally with the flight attendant present would help or escalate the situation. She also didn't want to overshadow the potential of a calmer resolution. Harvey slammed his palm against the armrest. "Don't believe her. She's obviously up to no good. I heard her speaking on the phone about dangerous activities, about the law and criminals. She's some sort of thug. She's going to cause trouble." Danielle's eyes widened in disbelief. She had indeed been quietly reading over text messages about her cases, some referencing criminals or investigations, but in no way had she mentioned dangerous activity that could be misconstrued as wrongdoing. He was twisting reality to incite fear, playing into the worst stereotypes about black passengers. The tension was suffocating, and she could see the flight attendant's hesitation. She was caught between a belligerent passenger making accusations and a calm passenger who seemed respectable. At that moment, one of the marshals, Brady, stood up. He addressed the flight attendant with quiet authority. "I haven't seen her do anything wrong," he said. "In fact, I've been seated behind her. She's been reading her phone and minding her own business." Harvey stared daggers at Brady, who looked to all outward appearances like a regular traveler stepping up to defuse a conflict. "Stay out of this," Harvey snapped, "unless you want me to report you as well." The flight attendant looked relieved to have a second voice confirming Danielle's innocence. "Sir," she told Harvey in a professional but firm tone, "we have no reason to remove anyone from this flight based on unfounded claims. If you are uncomfortable, we can see if we have any seat open for you to move, but there will be no forced removals unless there is a real threat." Harvey narrowed his eyes, furious at the perceived slight. "Fine," he spat. "Do whatever you want, but when something happens, it's on your hands." With a forced smile, the flight attendant turned to Danielle. "Ma'am, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to let us know." Then she turned to move on, though it was clear the tension in this section of the cabin wouldn't simply vanish. Danielle offered the flight attendant a polite nod, her heart still pounding. The sense of injustice weighed heavily on her. She wanted to stand up and publicly denounce Harvey's hateful words, but her training told her not to ignite a larger confrontation. Still, she felt the bruise to her dignity, and it burned within her like a slow, smoldering fire. The flight continued. Those nearest to the confrontation eyed Danielle with curious sympathy. Some might have recognized the blatant racism at play, others might have believed Harvey's outrageous claims. Fear and prejudice have a way of finding cracks in even the most rational minds. Danielle could almost hear the second guessing, see the doubt in some eyes. Is she really innocent, or is there something else going on? Her mind drifted back to what had initially caused her increased security detail. She had presided over a major drug trafficking case involving a violent cartel. Some threats were made directly against her life, describing horrifying consequences if the verdict didn't go a certain way. The U.S. Marshals had insisted on full-time protection, including on planes. Though her personal life was discreet, there was no telling who might leak her identity. As she stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, Danielle contemplated the irony of it all. She had real, dangerous enemies, but the person harassing her now was just a hateful man who wanted her gone because of the color of her skin. She felt an odd mix of relief and sadness that this was the conflict she was dealing with, rather than a professional assassin. Yet bigotry was its own ugly threat, one that existed within the everyday spaces where one should feel safe. Meanwhile, Harvey simmered in his seat. He occasionally shot whispered tirades to any passenger who would listen. A few travelers nodded politely, trying to extricate themselves from his rant. Others responded with a simple, "Let's just keep the peace." He was furious that the flight crew hadn't catered to his demands, and that only fueled his anger further. For the moment, though, he stayed seated, fuming silently. It was around halfway through the flight when the pilot announced they would experience a slight detour to avoid a storm system. This meant they would be in the air longer than initially planned. Groans and sighs echoed through the cabin, but the flight attendants assured everyone that safety was the priority. Many passengers tried to settle in, maybe catch a movie, read a book, or nap. Danielle herself considered losing herself in a film or listening to music to tune out the negativity swirling around her. Then came the moment that started unraveling everything. A passenger seated 2 rows ahead, who had overheard bits of Harvey's ranting, turned around and said to Danielle, "Don't let him get to you." "I heard what he was saying. It's just ignorance." Danielle appreciated the kindness, but Harvey used that moment to jump in with a raised voice. "Ignorance? You think I'm ignorant? I'm a paying, law-abiding citizen. I can spot trouble when I see it, and this woman, she's trouble." The passenger who had offered Danielle encouragement turned to Harvey, exasperated. "Man, do you even hear yourself? You're being ridiculous." Emboldened, Harvey unbuckled his seatbelt, leaning into the aisle. "Ridiculous, am I? You see who tries to speak up for her? Another misguided fool. But let me tell you all something, people like her want special treatment, to take over everything, and we're just supposed to sit back and let it happen? Well, I won't." At this point, the flight attendant who had dealt with him before hurried over, politely but firmly instructing him to remain seated and lower his voice. But Harvey, almost frothing with self-righteousness, gestured wildly. "I'm telling you, you better land this plane and get her off. She's dangerous. We can't be sure she's not a terrorist or something worse." Danielle felt her blood run cold. The word terrorist had crossed a dangerous line in post 9/11 travel. That accusation was heavy. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain calm. People were now definitely staring, many pulling out their phones, perhaps to record the outburst. Marshal Simmons, from his seat, cleared his throat loudly to catch the flight attendant's attention, signaling that this situation needed to be addressed before it spiraled further. The flight attendant nodded, but before she could intervene effectively, Harvey started pressing the call button repeatedly, summoning more staff. "This is an emergency," he insisted with a holler. "We're not safe with her on board. Who knows what she's planning?" 2 flight attendants and the head purser converged at Harvey's seat. The purser, a tall woman with an air of seasoned authority, addressed Harvey directly. "Sir, we need you to calm down. You're alarming the other passengers." Harvey stabbed a finger in Danielle's direction. "She's the threat. Remove her, or I'm making an official complaint to American Airlines that you endangered us all by ignoring my warnings." The purser's eyes flashed with professionalism and a hint of frustration. "Sir, we have no evidence that she poses any danger. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll have no choice but to file a report with the authorities once we land." Danielle silently thanked the purser for not caving to the false, bigoted accusations, but she also felt that dread, that feeling of being singled out. It was humiliating to have to rely on strangers to confirm her right to exist peacefully. Marshal Simmons stood up, stepping into the aisle for the first time in a more official capacity. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Harvey glowered at him. "Who are you, her boyfriend? You can't do anything about this, pal." Simmons reached into his jacket pocket, producing his official identification so only the flight attendant and the purser could see it. His voice was low. "I'm with the United States Marshal Service, and I can assure you that this passenger is no threat. Your behavior, on the other hand, is out of line. Let me advise you to stop causing a disturbance." The weight of those words settled into the air. Harvey's eyes went wide, flicking between Simmons and Danielle. For the first time, a hint of fear crept into his expression, but fear quickly transmuted into indignation. "A marshal? What are you doing on this plane, then?" He sounded both suspicious and resentful. Simmons, still calm, said, "I'm traveling on official business." He did not specify that his official business was to protect Danielle. For a moment, it seemed like the revelation might quell Harvey's outburst, but bigotry rarely surrenders so easily. With a sneer, Harvey spat out, "Figures you'd defend her. Probably compromised, probably part of some conspiracy. This is a setup." Marshal Simmons turned his body slightly, subtly signaling to Danielle that he was ready to act if needed. The purser intervened sternly, telling Harvey, "That's enough. Stay seated. Stop antagonizing other passengers." She then turned to the rest of the onlookers. "There is no threat on this flight. Everyone, please remain calm. We will have a smooth trip if we respect each other. A hush settled after that announcement. Some passengers murmured in agreement or relief. Harvey sank back into his seat, but the tension on his face remained, his eyes never leaving Danielle. The next hour was a test of endurance for Danielle. Harvey glared, occasionally whispering unkind or racist remarks under his breath. The two marshals sat on alert, the flight crew was watchful, and most of the passengers tried to return to whatever in-flight activities they had planned, though many kept sneaking glances at the conflict zone around row 21. Danielle attempted to focus on a case file she had on her phone, preparing for a hearing, but every so often, the hateful words she'd heard replayed in her mind: terrorist, just anyone, people like you. They echoed with painful familiarity. She reminded herself that she was a federal judge, well-educated, well-respected, and well within her rights, but racism has a cruel way of momentarily stealing one's sense of self-worth. A jolt of physical turbulence rattled the plane again. The pilot announced some bumps were ahead as they skirted a storm system. Danielle braced herself, inhaling and exhaling slowly. She closed her eyes, drawing on a memory of calmer times, a vacation she'd taken with her parents to the Caribbean when she was a child, the sound of gentle waves lapping against the sand. Sometimes that memory helped her maintain composure amid the shaking aircraft. Harvey let out a string of agitated complaints, pressing the call button again. This time, the flight attendant arrived, annoyance creeping into her otherwise professional demeanor. "Sir, the captain has asked everyone to remain seated during this turbulence." "Is there something urgent?" Harvey gestured toward Danielle, who was quietly reading. "She's flustering me," he insisted, as if her presence alone caused him emotional turmoil. "I demand that you make her switch seats or take her somewhere else." By now, the flight attendant had reached her limit. She spoke in a hushed but firm tone. "Sir, we have no open seats, and even if we did, we would not move her. You're the one instigating these conflicts. Please remain calm, or you will be reported to the authorities when we land." A flicker of rage passed across Harvey's features, but he noticed the unsettled glare from Marshal Simmons, who was watching the exchange. Not wanting another confrontation with a federal agent, Harvey pursed his lips and sat back. The flight attendant moved on, attending to others. The tension, however, remained as thick as ever. It happened just as the turbulence subsided. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign was switched off again. Passengers began to relax, some dozing, others reading or watching movies. Danielle let herself exhale a cautious sigh of relief, hoping that perhaps the worst had passed. But the peace was short-lived. A flight attendant passed by with a trash bag to collect empty cups or food wrappers. She paused at Harvey's row, and he quickly cornered her with renewed hostility. "I need to make a complaint," he said, his voice dripping with entitlement. The flight attendant, in a clipped tone, replied, "I'll pass your concerns to the purser." "Now, if you'll excuse me." Harvey grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to cause real harm, but enough to violate the boundary of decency. "Don't you walk away from me," he snarled. Instantly, alarms went off in Danielle's head, as well as in the minds of the nearby passengers. The flight attendant tugged her wrist free, stepping back. "Sir, do not touch me," she said, eyes wide with indignation. Almost in unison, Marshal Brady stood up from his seat behind Danielle, while Marshal Simmons unbuckled his seatbelt ahead. They exchanged a swift look, silently coordinating. Danielle watched, heart pounding. This was the moment she feared, the moment where everything could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. Brady, trying to de-escalate, spoke calmly. "Sir, you need to calm down and keep your hands to yourself. You've caused enough disturbance on this flight." Harvey's eyes darted between Brady and Simmons, who now stood in the aisle, effectively blocking Harvey from moving further. Then Harvey swung his gaze to Danielle, pointing a trembling finger at her. "It's her fault. She's the one who..." Brady cut him off, showing his badge for all to see. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and I'm telling you to stop immediately." Harvey froze for a moment. He looked like a man standing at the precipice of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. Then his bigotry and fury overtook him. "I don't care who you are," he shouted, voice cracking. "Do your job and protect us from her." He lunged toward the aisle, as if to move around the marshals, but they were faster. In a swift motion, Marshal Simmons stepped into the aisle, arms outstretched to prevent Harvey from charging forward. Harvey's momentum collided with Simmons, but Simmons was solidly built and well-trained. He deflected the man's attempt to break past him. Marshal Brady, seeing that the situation was becoming physically dangerous, moved to help restrain Harvey. "Sir, you need to sit down," Brady said, voice steady with the commanding authority of law enforcement. The flight attendant, shaken, looked at the marshals with wide eyes. Danielle felt her pulse thunder in her ears. She was trapped in the row, forced to watch the confrontation. The entire cabin was now on high alert, passengers straining to see what was happening. Some were filming the altercation, phones raced to capture every moment. A hush fell, broken only by the rush of air from the plane's ventilation system and Harvey's furious panting. Harvey, now cornered, spat out words that dripped with unfiltered hate. "You don't understand. This is my country. People like her don't belong, and I'll be damned if I share a plane with." Brady and Simmons exchanged a look. That was enough. They had tolerated his words as long as it remained nonviolent, but now he was borderline assaulting flight crew and making disturbing remarks that threatened passenger safety. They had the authority and the duty to take him into custody if he posed a threat to the flight. Marshal Simmons reached for his handcuffs, always discreetly carried, even when traveling. "Sir, you're under arrest for interfering with a flight crew and assault," he announced quietly but firmly. "Do not resist, or we will be forced to restrain you further." Harvey's eyes widened in shock. It was as if the gravity of the situation finally dawned on him. A hush fell over the onlookers. Danielle watched, feeling a swirl of relief and fear. She had never wished for an arrest to happen mid-flight, but clearly, it had become unavoidable. Harvey's brand of hatred had escalated into physical confrontation. "You can't arrest me for telling the truth," Harvey shouted. "This is tyranny. Who do you think you are? You have no idea who I am. I know people, powerful people." Marshal Brady and Marshal Simmons maintained their composure, ignoring the bluster. "Place your hands on the seat in front of you," Brady instructed. Harvey, face flushed with rage, seemed on the brink of compliance, then twisted, trying to snatch the seatbelt from Simmons in a bizarre attempt to lash out. But his movement was slow and clumsy compared to the marshal's training. They pinned his arms gently but firmly, avoiding unnecessary force. In a matter of seconds, he was handcuffed. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant hurried to the phone to inform the pilot of the arrest in progress. Danielle felt her heart hammering in her chest, relief mixing with shock at the surreal spectacle. She never wanted this confrontation, but she couldn't deny that justice was being served. One part of her mind whispered a small, defiant yes. With Harvey effectively subdued, the marshals guided him toward a seat in the back of the plane, away from other passengers, as a flight attendant cleared a spot. He spewed curses and racist epithets under his breath, but with his hands cuffed and 2 U.S. Marshals flanking him, there was little else he could do. Passengers craned their necks to watch him go. Some wore expressions of shock, others relief, and a few gave Danielle supportive nods. Marshal Brady lingered in the row where Danielle sat, ensuring she was all right. She glanced at him, voice shaky. "I'm fine," she managed, though the adrenaline coursed through her veins. "Thank you." He nodded, a warm empathy in his eyes. "We're just doing our job," he said softly, "and we're sorry you had to endure that." Danielle gave a faint smile. "I appreciate you both," she replied. She realized how much it meant that, in a moment of such intense hatred, there were good people willing to stand up and do what was right. On the one hand, she had been a victim of vile racism, on the other, she had the shield of law enforcement who believed in protecting her rights. The contrast was striking, and it bolstered her resolve. Once Harvey was secured in the back, the plane's tension level mercifully began to drop. The pilot announced over the intercom that an in-flight disturbance had been resolved by federal agents on board and that there was no cause for alarm. He also stated they would proceed to Los Angeles as planned, where local authorities would be notified to meet them upon arrival. Life in the cabin tried to resume a semblance of normalcy. Flight attendants moved about, distributing water, trying to soothe frazzled nerves. Passengers whispered among themselves about what had happened. Some approached Danielle quietly to offer solidarity or apologies on behalf of humanity for what she'd endured. Others gave her a wide berth, uncertain how to engage. Danielle found her hands trembling again, the adrenaline rush fading. She closed her eyes, inhaling and exhaling, grounding herself. She remembered her father's words, "Hold your head high, baby girl. You are worthy." She was determined not to let one person's hatred define her experience. Marshal Simmons and Marshal Brady checked on her periodically. They also conferred discreetly about how best to handle the situation upon landing. There would be paperwork, statements, possible legal proceedings for Harvey. The flight attendants were relieved that federal law enforcement had been on board, preventing what could have been an even bigger disaster. Danielle opened her phone's notes app and jotted down the sequence of events while they were still fresh in her mind. She knew the protocol: the airline might need a statement, and so might the authorities. In that moment, she felt the solid ground of her profession reassert itself. The calm, methodical process of writing down facts steadied her nerves. She felt a pang of sadness for all the times such bigotry went unchecked, for others who endured it without the protection of U.S. Marshals right there to intervene. It was a sharp reminder of the privilege of her position, even though the threat to her life was the very reason she had that protection in the first place. The world could be cruel, but sometimes there were glimmers of justice that sparkled through. With about an hour left in the flight, Marshal Simmons quietly took the aisle seat across from Danielle. He kept his voice low. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded, though she could not entirely hide the weariness in her eyes. "I'll be okay, thanks to both of you for your quick response." He dipped his head in acknowledgement. "That's our job, but I'm sorry you had to deal with that kind of abuse." She stared out the window for a moment, the endless blue sky reflecting in her eyes. "It's not the first time," she admitted, "but it's never been this public or this volatile." Simmons sighed. "We see a lot of bad behavior, but hate speech on a plane is particularly dangerous. You handled yourself with a lot of composure." Danielle offered a wan smile. "Being a judge teaches you something about composure, but it doesn't make it less hurtful." He understood. "I get that," he replied softly. "After we land, we'll have to coordinate with airport police. They'll likely want a brief statement from you. We'll keep it as smooth as possible." A moment of silence passed, a shared understanding between them. Danielle felt the waves of fatigue, the mental exhaustion that comes from a conflict so raw. She was grateful for the Marshals, not just for their protection but for their empathy in the aftermath. Sometimes the physical threat ends, but the emotional toll lingers like an echo in the soul. When the captain announced their initial descent into Los Angeles, the cabin stirred with renewed energy. Tray tables clicked shut, seats returned to their upright positions, and seatbelts were fastened. Danielle's heart pounded, not from fear of landing, but from anticipation of the scene that awaited them on the ground. She knew the local authorities would be waiting. She wondered what would happen to Harvey. Would he realize the gravity of his actions? Would he face the consequences that came with hurling hateful slurs and assaulting a flight attendant? Harvey himself remained cuffed in the back, guarded by Marshal Brady. His outbursts had quieted, though occasional muffled curses could be heard. The flight attendants had offered him water, which he'd refused with a sneer. He was like a caged animal, cornered by the outcome of his own aggression. Danielle tried to remain composed, gazing out the window at the sprawling Los Angeles cityscape as it came into view. This trip, intended for a mixture of work and a little rest, had morphed into an experience she would never forget. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that once they landed, everything would be sorted out properly. The landing was smooth, and the plane taxied to the gate under the guidance of air traffic control. Passengers waited anxiously to disembark, but the crew asked everyone to remain seated for a moment. Danielle saw through the window the flashing lights of airport police vehicles parked near the jet bridge. Her stomach flipped, a swirl of relief and lingering nerves. This was the final stage. When the door finally opened, uniformed officers and airline security personnel boarded. Passengers stared, wide-eyed. A hush fell over them again. Marshal Simmons explained the situation briefly to the lead officer. Then, with calm precision, Marshal Brady escorted Harvey from the plane, handing him over to local law enforcement. Harvey's face was a storm of anger, shame, and a hint of fear. In one last-ditch effort, he shouted to the rest of the cabin, "This isn't over. You'll all regret this." But the silent stares he received in return spoke volumes. No one was buying his victim act anymore. After a moment, he was led away, leaving a vacuum of quiet behind him. Once Harvey was removed, the purser thanked the passengers for their patience, and the cabin erupted in hushed chatter as everyone began to gather their belongings. Danielle was asked to remain on board briefly, as the authorities wanted a statement. She complied, stepping off the plane only after most passengers had deplaned. Some whispered words of solidarity as they passed her, "Stay strong. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Thank you for handling it with grace." She nodded in acknowledgement, her emotions a swirl of gratitude and weariness. Outside, she provided a quick statement to an airport police officer, describing what had happened. Marshal Simmons corroborated her account. The flight attendant who'd been grabbed also gave her testimony, tears of anger and relief welling in her eyes. The officer thanked Danielle, apologizing on behalf of the city for such an unpleasant welcome. Danielle gave a small shrug. "Not your fault," she said softly. "Racism exists everywhere." With that, the matter was formally in the hands of local law enforcement. Danielle and the marshals made their way into the terminal. The day had been long, draining, and jarring, but it was finally over, at least for now. Once inside the terminal, Danielle found a quiet corner to collect herself, her marshals on either side. She made a few calls, first to her court clerk, informing them that she had arrived but might be delayed dealing with official follow-up on the incident. Then she spoke to her mother, who had texted her multiple times after hearing rumors about an incident on a flight. Recounting the ordeal over the phone was emotionally taxing, but her mother's voice offered the solace Danielle needed. Marshal Brady and Marshal Simmons stood discreetly nearby, giving her space while still maintaining their protective posture. When Danielle hung up, she approached them. "What happens to him?" she asked. Marshal Simmons exhaled. "He'll likely face charges for interfering with a flight crew, assault on the flight attendant, plus possible civil rights violations, though that part can be more complicated to prove. Either way, it's out of our hands now." She nodded, not feeling elation but a sober acceptance that the justice system would handle him. "Thank you both again. You went above and beyond." Brady gave her a reassuring smile. "We're just glad you're safe. We'll stick with you until you're settled." And in that moment, Danielle felt the odd sense that, in a world of injustice, there was some measure of rightness that could still be found. Some days later, after Danielle had attended her meetings in Los Angeles and was preparing for her return flight, on which she'd again have protection, she received an update from a colleague. Harvey had been arraigned, and the charges had not only stuck, but more had been added based on his threatening language, the recordings from other passengers' phones, and the flight attendant's statement about his physical aggression. It turned out that he had a history of disruptive, racially charged incidents. Only this time, the consequences were far more severe. Civil suits were rumored, and, in short, Harvey was about to face the full wrath of the legal system he so arrogantly claimed to understand. Danielle felt no triumphant joy in the news, just a sense of closure. Justice was unfolding as it should. She quietly reflected on how, sometimes, karma indeed visited those who spewed hatred, and it did so not through cosmic happenstance but through the unwavering stand of good people who refused to tolerate it. Despite her resilience, Danielle couldn't deny that the incident had left a mark. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder more often, particularly in public spaces. But she also felt a renewed sense of determination. She would continue her work with the same fierce integrity, ensuring that the courts remained a place where justice, not prejudice, reigned. She thought of the flight attendant, the marshals, and the supportive passengers. Their kindness was a reminder that, for every hateful voice, there were many who believed in equality and respect. In her quiet moments, she remembered the adrenaline pounding in her veins, the terror of hearing accusations of being a terrorist, a threat, simply for existing while black. But she also remembered the immediate reassurance from those around her, 2 U.S. Marshals who stood firmly against injustice, flight attendants who refused to be bullied, and a majority of passengers who did not join in or encourage the vitriol. It was a microcosm of the world, hatred clashing with empathy, ignorance met with knowledge, cruelty confronted by courage. Long after returning home, Danielle found herself reflecting on that flight with a somber sense of gratitude that no one had been truly harmed. She wrote a private journal entry about how prejudice and hate were self-destructive forces. Harvey had tried to destroy her dignity, only to end up exposing his own flaws before the law. She concluded that if she, with her resources and legal standing, could be subject to such venom, there was a moral imperative to stand up for those more vulnerable. It fueled her passion to continue her judicial duties with a keen eye for injustice and a compassionate heart for victims. In the end, this harrowing ordeal reminded her of what truly mattered: the unyielding pursuit of fairness, empathy, and decency. The flight, once intended as a simple trip, had become a crucible, testifying to the power of righteous intervention. And from that crucible, she emerged more certain than ever of who she was and what she stood for. Sometimes, the darkest storms reveal the brightest acts of courage. Danielle's flight was anything but ordinary. It became a battle between hatred and justice, resilience and cruelty. Though shaken by the vicious words of a stranger, she stood her ground, her dignity unbroken. With the steadfast support of the U.S. Marshals and airline staff, she witnessed the power of good people uniting to quash the darkness of bigotry. Stories like these remind us all that prejudice is not just a relic of the past, it exists here and now, demanding our vigilance. Yet every act of defiance against hatred, every choice to protect and uplift others, inches us toward a fairer, kinder world. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Dark Stories to spread its message of resilience and justice. Let's keep shining a light on what true courage and compassion look like, together.